Hello everyone, welcome to the chapter-wise analysis of the novel Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen. Chapter 1. In this chapter, we are introduced to the Bennet family and the opening line has become famous. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a life. This line sets the tone for the novel and reflects the societal expectation of wealthy men seeking marriage. The dialogue between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet provides insight into their characters and relationship. Mrs. Bennet is eager to share news about the letting of Netherfield Park, anticipating a wealthy suitor for one of her daughters. Mr. Bennet, on the other hand, appears more reserved and sarcastic. There's a humorous tone in their exchange, and it foreshadows the dynamics of the relationships in the novel. The characters of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are presented with distinct traits. Mr. Bennet is portrayed as having quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, while Mrs. Bennet is described as a woman with mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. The contrast between the two characters is a recurring theme in the novel. The chapter also highlights the societal expectations of the time, where marriage was often seen as a primary goal for women. Mrs. Bennet is depicted as being preoccupied with the marriage prospects of her daughters, particularly with the news of Mr. Bingley's arrival in the neighborhood. Overall, the chapter sets the stage for the unfolding plot of Pride and Prejudice and introduces the social and familial themes that will be explored throughout the novel. Chapter 2. Introduction. In Chapter 2 of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, the focus is on Mr. Bennet's visit to Mr. Bingley, further exploring the dynamics within the Bennet family. Mr. Bennet, despite earlier assertions that he would not visit Mr. Bingley, ends up being among the first to call on him. The reason for his change of heart is not explicitly stated, but it seems to be driven by a desire to assess Mr. Bingley for himself. The interaction between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet during this visit reflects their contrasting personalities, with Mrs. Bennet being eager for social connections and marriages for her daughters, while Mr. Bennet appears more skeptical and reserved. There's humor in Mr. Bennet's interaction with his daughters, particularly Elizabeth or Lizzie, who is busy trimming a hat. This chapter also sheds light on Mrs. Bennet's disapproval of Mrs. Long, who is supposed to introduce Mr. Bingley to the Bennet family. Mrs. Bennet's frustration is evident, and Mr. Bennet, with his characteristic sarcasm, teases her about the situation. The chapter highlights the social norms of the time, where social events such as balls were significant in terms of making introductions and connections. Mrs. Bennet's preoccupation with the upcoming ball and the potential for Mr. Bingley to dance with one of her daughters illustrates the societal emphasis on marriage and social standing. Conclusion. As with the previous chapter, the text continues to develop the characters and relationships within the Bennet family and sets the stage for the unfolding events in the novel. Chapter 3. Introduction. Chapter 3 of Pride and Prejudice provides further insight into the social events surrounding Mr. Bingley's arrival in the neighborhood and the initial impressions of various characters. Mrs. Bennet, eager to gather information about Mr. Bingley, tries to extract details from her husband and daughters. However, Mr. Bennet remains evasive in his descriptions, and the family eventually relies on Lady Lucas for information. Lady Lucas's report is highly favorable, describing Mr. Bingley as young, handsome, and agreeable, sparking excitement and expectations among the Bennet family. When Mr. Bingley returns Mr. Bennet's visit, Mrs. Bennet eagerly plans a dinner, but the plans are disrupted when Mr. Bingley announces his need to be in town the following day. Mrs. Bennet becomes anxious about Mr. Bingley's intentions and fears that he may not settle in Netherfield as expected. The chapter then shifts to the Netherfield Assembly, where Mr. Bingley arrives with his sisters, his brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, and the enigmatic Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley is well received, seen as amiable, and expresses his intention to host a ball at Netherfield. In contrast, Mr. Darcy's initial popularity diminishes due to his perceived pride and disagreeable behavior. The chapter concludes with Mrs. Bennet's enthusiastic account of the ball to Mr. Bennet, emphasizing Mr. Bingley's admiration of Jane and Mrs. Bennet's displeasure at Mr. Darcy's perceived slight towards Elizabeth. This section highlights the growing tension between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, setting the stage for further developments in their relationship. Conclusion. The chapter masterfully blends social commentary, humor, and the complexities of character relationships, capturing the nuances of early 19th century English society. Chapter 4 Introduction. In Chapter 4 of Pride and Prejudice, the narrative delves into the reaction of characters to Mr. Bingley and his sisters, primarily through the perspectives of Jane and Elizabeth Bennet. When Jane and Elizabeth discuss Mr. Bingley, Jane expresses her admiration for him, describing him as sensible, good-humoured, lively, and possessing happy manners. Elizabeth, with her characteristic wit, remarks that being handsome is also a desirable trait for a young man. Their conversation provides insight into Jane's more reserved nature and Elizabeth's tendency to analyze people and situations. The sisters discuss Mr. Bingley's sisters, who at first do not impress Elizabeth. She notes that their manners are not equal to Mr. Bingley's, and she remains somewhat skeptical about their charm. Elizabeth's keen observation and less pliant temperament contrast with Jane's more forgiving and gentle nature. The narrative then delves into the characters of Mr. Bingley's sisters, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst. They are described as proud and conceited, though not lacking in good humor when pleased. The sisters are portrayed as rather fine ladies with a significant fortune, educated in a prestigious seminary. Their social habits, such as spending more than they should and associating with people of rank, contribute to their sense of entitlement. The chapter further explores Mr. Bingley's background, his inherited wealth, and the dynamics between Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. Despite their differing characters, the two men share a steady friendship. Bingley is depicted as easygoing, open, and relying on Mr. Darcy's judgment. Darcy, on the other hand, is portrayed as haughty, reserved, and fastidious with manners that are not as inviting. The contrast in how Bingley and Darcy perceive the Meryton Assembly reflects their differing personalities. Bingley enjoys the company and finds everyone pleasant, especially praising Miss Bennet. In contrast, Darcy finds little beauty and no fashion in the people at the assembly, including Miss Bennet, whom he acknowledges as pretty but criticizes for smiling too much. Conclusion. The chapter highlights the intricate interplay of characters, social dynamics, and the different perspectives of the two sisters.